name is Pat Dolan, and we are in a process of short talks that talk about our work with the Teacher Union Reform Network. One of the more interesting things, of course, about the Teacher Union Reform Network is that it was begun by the two unions working in collaboration with one another, both the Federation and the Educational Association. And that in itself, at least when it began 25 years ago, was a dramatic kind of approach to change. Second, it always targeted not only the educational reform itself and its profession and practice, but it was conscious of the fact that it also had to think and create a place where we could think deeply about the role of the teacher union itself. All right? Anybody who looks at the labor history of the last 40 years in the United States knows that in some senses when there are huge shifts outside in the competitive world, and in many ways it just, this kind of change that we're going to address now rolls across the country. It rolls in the private sector first. It begins in steel, and it begins in steel industry in the 1960s. The world is one by then. And by that I simply mean the level of skills are very much the same. If it is not true, then you can borrow money in the world at the same price, and hence you can build infrastructure more or less at the same price. And therefore you start looking for, if you will, labor costs and so forth. So the world becomes enormously competitive overnight, industry by industry, but the industry's role within 3 to 4 or 5 years. So it goes steel. Steel automatically leads to automotive parts and then automotive manufacturing. And then it leads into agricultural products, tooling at the same time. Then it moved into the rubber industry overnight and so forth. And if I were to look at my own work in labor management collaboration, I followed that, if you will, as a migrant worker would almost. Across one kind of harvest after another. All right? And so we spent 3, 4, 5 years in each of those rolling industries. When you do that, interestingly enough, if you look at what's really happening, there are huge competitive changes in the quality of product in the world and in the cost. When that happens, the management wakes up, looks at the data, hopefully early enough. And if they are smart at all, all right, they move immediately to sharing that truth and that data with their organized labor group. The organized labor group comes to that very suspiciously early on, as they usually do, because when management shares data around cost and quality, they're about to ask you for all sorts of things. Right? And so in the middle of a transition like that, if you're the third party, you basically end up saying, all right, let's start talking to each other about whether we trust this information or not. But it happens so quickly that you have to build at the top, at the international level, at Ford and the UAW. And I was blessed to make 8 years of a journey there with wonderful leaders on both sides. We had to, first of all, build the case that we had to make significant changes in everything we did, everything. And that, of course, creates downtown, if you will. Across the street in Dearborn, it means that the same discussion has to be going on at the UAW, at the international level, with Don Eflin as the president at that stage. First of all, in charge of the Ford side, and then as president, and then he went on to be in charge of General Motors side. All right. What that means is that the union has to ask the same set of questions. Is this our journey? And the answer ultimately is yes. It is your journey. It has to be made separately than Ford management and so forth, but you make it together or you die. All right? And if anybody who followed that 20 years and then kind of the forced kind of financing of the industry in Detroit and Dearborn, only one group made it without having to, in some senses, give away their ownership and their financing, and it was the group that built the collaborative structure strong enough to hold and to make it through the very, very difficult journey. And that was Ford and the UAW. So in general, the union has to ask this question almost immediately as well. So you go through this and you move to the FAA after the PATCO strike. You move to Boeing and the machinists and so forth. Every industry has had to ask this question and to figure out whether the union trusted the management enough to make the journey. So here we are. I mean, take a look then at kind of the argument as it makes its feelings, if you will, and its cognitive way into the public sector. Right? It starts in certain areas and moves very, very fast in competitive language, all right, and so forth. And in there are very interesting questions around whether or not there are certain pieces of public sector service that should not be brought to the scrutiny of a competitive model, quality, productivity, and so forth. It's a legitimate set of debates, all right? It is still not settled in the country, but it is clear that the whole entire service, medical service in the last 3 to 4 years, we have moved to a very interesting model. We moved to privatization, then we moved back because of the issues that are clear at the core, kind of ethical core of a democracy or any advanced country. If you don't get the right kind of coverage and the right kind of public service, you have to go back and somehow rebalance that. We've done so with the utilities, all right? We've certainly done so with the Postal Service, all right? So you say, what else is there? We've certainly done that with prisons, if you will. I'm not saying these are great journeys. I'm simply saying that we've made some set of journeys and questions. And we are now in the middle of that questioning in terms of public education. You know, what is in some senses untouchable in terms of a public service that should only be kept there, and what kind of public service? We've always had room for people who decide to go privately in terms of education, all right? And that was done, interesting enough, because of overriding religious and other kinds of value questions that we said, oh, that's acceptable as long as in some senses it fits and is not contradictory to public values in a democracy. And there are always questions around how far we let those private sector groups go with respect to that. So now here we are in a deep shift, and the fundamental questions become the same ones. In terms of competitive analysis, i.e. quality, all right, is this the right kind of model that we have? And it's been fascinating to watch. You know, the comparisons, first of all, data-wise, and then in terms of dialogue in the last 3 or 4 years under the present Secretary and administration, with Finland, with South Korea, and so forth and so on, New Zealand, around our models, and whether there are much better models around children of poverty in terms of reach, in terms of success, and so forth. Very interesting to look at the recruitment of the profession, all right, in various other kinds of democracies, and so forth. How they are chosen, how they are financed, how they are trained, how they are included into the profession and paid, all of those issues. All right, we have our own particular history here, and the particular history started in the 60s and the 70s, late in the industrialization and collective bargaining or organizing. The public sector slowly came because of, in some senses, the untouchables, if you will, that somehow said that, oh, service in police, service in fire, service in education shouldn't be allowed to be included in collective bargaining. We moved in the 70s, and for the most part, with certain regional exceptions, we moved to a collective bargaining model. We are also now in the process of watching erosion around that, and kind of a restatement of those old arguments in places like Wisconsin that say, oh, these groups are exempt from, pulled out of collective bargaining because of the following. All I want to point out is this debate is not over by any means, and we are in the middle of it. Charter schools certainly, in some senses, are a challenge, if you will, to public-private in terms of both for-profit and not-for-profit delivery of public education. What we want to do in here is to constantly ask authentic questions around whether we have this organized labor group, the group that represents the professional voice in here, whether we have that right and correct. And one of the things we do in turn is that we need both, and we have always had from the very beginning, both unions deeply involved in this. And over the last 3 or 4 years, the regional structure of TURN has stayed very, very close to the leadership of both unions, because we think that our learning here, out there on the advanced level, is in some senses ought to be used for them in thinking about their next steps with respect to all sorts of these journeys. Here's one thought or one frame that we use to talk about, if you will, kind of what that journey might be like and what it has always been like, but maybe has been out of balance with respect to. All right? This union, either the AFT or the NEA, either one, all right, and they were born quite differently, as we all know, all right? One born out of a social justice model, pure and simple, all right? All right. The AFT comes out of Chicago with some radical and wonderful women early on, changes in some senses the face of public education, all right, moves it in a certain direction. When the EA is founded, if you will, and comes into this thing is already moved to some extent, all right? And it brings back a certain maleness to it, a certain kind of administrative and professional piece to it, all right? But in general, they have gone separate but similar ways with respect to at least three ways to talk about this, all right? There is certainly an area in which we would have to say that the early language, the early kinds of legislation that we moved in behind in the early states, all of that, in some senses, was conditioned by an industrial set of languages, frames, and legislation. And by that I simply mean that much of the early bargaining has with it a kind of language around pay. Not simply that we negotiate this and what's possible to be collectively bargained and so forth in the early legislation in various states, but the way in which we actually frame the idea of pay. And it, in some senses, moves out of an industrial piece into hourly in many ways, hourly pay and hourly measurements of the pay. It moves to certain grades, if you will, all right, of pay, but it moves mostly to a piece that is included called seniority in terms of the pay, and the movement around the grades is based fundamentally or primarily early on for 20 or 30 years. If you look at the collective bargaining agreements, you advance in terms of pay based mostly on your years of service. Those are industrial pieces, all right, that in some senses use those kinds of approaches, plus the benefits and so forth that also ride, if you will, all right, those horses of seniority and pay in various ways. Let's talk a little bit about a piece that in some senses gets good talk here lately and bad definition and polarization early on, and that's in some senses the language of tenure, all right? Tenure has nothing to do, all right, with the piece that in some senses it gets confused with, which is to say the last piece in here, true of all organized labor groups, is a kind of a fairness issue. That is to say, anybody in here over against the management in terms of its practice and the movement of somebody in here or the loss of one's job and so forth, all right, due process is extremely important. It simply means a fairness set of processes at various levels in which there are hearings with both sides in terms of the relationship of an individual practitioner and the system, all right? Clear what due process is. And this thing has been very successful at building this legislatively. Tenure is a different issue. The nature of this kind of work is political at some level. And by political, I simply mean that when you teach a community's children, you always are moving, except in the purest sense of subject matter, you are always moving underneath it with subject matter that contains values. And the values, if you will, are convictions around what life is about, what we ought to believe about, kind of even the history of life and so forth and so on. When you move in science towards those kinds of issues, in literature or social science, into issues in which value questions are asked, all right, there is a danger in this profession, as in others, but particularly in this kind of a profession, there's a danger that somehow you become vulnerable, all right, to loss of job or deep wounding of your professional life, all right, by a group that in some senses does not have anything to do with your quality. the quality of your work, the quality of your teaching, the quality of your preparation, and so forth. It has to do with, in some senses, the value tenor of the way you teach and how you teach it in a community. And because it is politicized in that sense, it always was felt, and still should be felt, that one needs a protection in here around that kind of aspect, element, and dimension of the work. So that someone ought to have deep protection that pulls into the due process if there is any kind of an approach in which it has nothing to do with the quality, but has to do with, in some senses, the community's or a small subgroup of the community's ideas around values. All right? That is, in some senses, comes out of the universities in Europe historically, and it was an element that probably, in this polarized United States right now, is probably more valuable than it's ever been, all right, probably since the 30s. So I simply want to say there is an industrial but also historical pieces here of pay, benefits, working conditions, obviously, the pay based on some sort of seniority and so forth, and elements of a powerful due process. The other two pieces of this, this thing called a teachers' union, is in some senses comes, if you will, after the fact. After the fact, but always has been part of the puzzle. And those are the aspects of the fact that this work also has to do, particularly in a democracy, all right? It has always had to do with social justice. And it means, what that means is, that one should not be surprised if this union not only represents its own people, its own adults with respect to its practice and so forth, but that it keeps a particular kind of protective role and voice around the work with poor children, children in some senses who come with deep disadvantages, special education, by race, by economic background, and so forth. This profession always has been, in some senses, also an advocate for this. Not universally, all right? Not in every community, but in general, at the core of its founding, all right? And I alluded to where it started and so forth. This has been a fundamental role. It may not have found its way into collective bargaining language as strongly as all of the industrial language did, but it has clearly been an ongoing set of values and debates. It has occurred, if you look at the minutes over many, many years of when this group comes together, either group comes together to talk about its issues, very often, all right, for long periods, all right, in the 80s and the 90s, all right. When this group comes together as a national group to talk about its work, there is very little mention, actually, of educationally specific and deep debate around what you would call the larger social justice issues of the society. All I want to say is that this has been always true, all right, and it has been probably particularly true at different points in its history. And the last piece that I want to simply introduce here is that there has always been the growth of a profession here, right, in the sense that this group is not in any way defined only by industrial language. There are pieces that if you only go down that road, you basically lose track of some issues around how one gets paid and for what, all right? How one enters the profession, how one grows in the profession, and so forth. There are aspects of profession that ought to include meritocracy in some deep sense, high skills, other kinds of skills, different levels of the practice so that there is a ladder or a gradient around a master teacher, a coach, a fundamental teacher, an entry-level teacher, and so forth. All of those issues are professional language, all right? And the question then is who controls that? And very often that is not controlled usually in a profession by the administration of the delivery. Hospital administrators do not control, all right, the training, ongoing improvement of a thoracic surgeon. That in some senses is always controlled by a board of thoracic surgeons. One is updated and required to update oneself by that board every 2 to 3 years to have board certification. That has nothing to do, all right, with the major university hospital where that person practices and so forth. So the professional piece has always had its own life apart from where it's done. apart from where it's done. That has come probably in terms of its robustness late to this debate, but is certainly, all right, as we've looked at the latest years of reform, is now on the table. On the table in the sense of saying, what areas should this profession, as a profession, and who should speak for the profession? And there are certainly voices who say, all right, inside the union and outside, that in some senses this union ought to stay here and not venture into these areas, as well as there are very powerful voices inside and outside of the union that simply say we cannot sacrifice either this or this. And as a matter of fact, improvement in this, in some senses, leads us, all right, to confront the issues of whether we are making any kind of deep inroad here, and that the pay issues have to be balanced somehow around skill, all right, and ongoing improvement and practice, and some sort of protection surely around politics and tenure, all right, and surely around due process. And the question is whether we need to look at the seniority issue again, and to look at, in some senses, fair and equitable ways to evaluate this practice. Clearly, these unions are not going to make, all right, a kind of a realistic attempt to enter that area, and we certainly have places where they have, all right, to look at, in some senses, what would be required of input from their people and themselves in order to make this evaluation piece a credible, long-term, viable way to enter into this collective bargaining agreement. That surely, and way down the road probably, is to say that this ought to, and we need to debate profoundly across the country, what ought to be the elements of this. It certainly ought to have process, if you will, observations. By that I mean kind of professionals looking at the work of teaching in an ongoing fashion, not once and then never again. To look at how one is practicing this as the curriculum subject matter changes, as the children change and so forth. This needs to be a viable process. We probably need to revisit having walked away overnight from any kind of input kinds of, and by that I simply mean where one goes to school, how that is affected, how one basically adds other degrees and so forth. We walked away overnight from the input piece and we moved to some combination, all right, without the proper research to say, let's look at pure output in the sense of children's test scores and so forth, and other kinds of measures as well as process. We really need to look at those three again. My point being that if you build quietly, thoughtfully, and collaboratively an evaluation process that the profession actually believes in and helped construct and helps deliver, one has a chance of moving it to supplement some of the old industrial language. It's pretty clear that this is in some senses open for debate and on the table. What we don't want to have happen is this to close fast because of very poor kind of approaches to the professional piece and so forth. We need to keep it open long enough that our voices, the voices of the two unions, can basically move deeply into this. To move into the evaluation, you have to start way back. What is it we think we're doing here? What are we being asked to do? What would we define as really good teaching? What would we define as a way to think about output, all right, and process observations? How would we own a good deal of how that goes about? In which case we would then be willing to talk about evaluation. Whether one has in the long term any base to be able to hook to children's learning and the long-term kind of output questions, all right? It probably needs to be opened up in terms of quality, all right? That is to say, the quality of the work, the growth of the child, the social justice questions, as well as broad cognitive development. If that were in some senses put in here and one could figure out some sort of causal nexus between the role of these individuals and these children, it seems to me the work is too complex, the movement is too complex, all right, to basically get there, but we certainly ought to take a very careful long-term approach to that. Fundamentally, though, the profession has to, in some senses, own this or partially own this in order to be called a profession. I've alluded elsewhere to say that it also probably has to have deep input into two other areas. One is the use of time and the definition of the role itself as it's played out, and ultimately the entry into, all right, and the accreditation, if you will, and licensing of the professional herself.